So it's starting now. So it's a pleasure to start this new webinar on complex society and digital tools and the role of digital tools. And I would like to start with a quotation by French anthropologist Philippe Descola, who in 2019, in a short paper, said that the absolutely central challenge of this century seems to be to find forms of articulation between local ways of living the world and integration of these local ways of living the world into institutional systems that would federate them without destroying their particularities. And I think that this was a nice way of summing up some attention that we have, I mean, from the modern history. Because if you look at the history, of course, is that you know better than me, of course, that the Industrial Revolution meant a transition from small communities, okay, these local ways of living the world, into an era of bigness, of big industry, big markets. Okay, it's an integration into institutional systems at the world scale. And I mean, to take one example, consumption, which used to be local, supplemented with some exotic imported foodstuff like tobacco and spices, just became interconnected at the world scale and homogenized. So this was made possible by the invention of the steam machine, the train, the telegraph. Okay, this is well known, which dramatically lowered the transportation costs. And this allowed the creation of a global network, which also necessitated a less well-known control revolution to regulate the flow of information, okay, using numbers. Okay, so this meant also moving from intimate knowledge and face-to-face trust to impersonal relations and trust in abstract numbers, okay? And the trend, of course, is even clearer today with the digital platforms from the West and from China also, of course, which are profoundly changing our economy and our social organization as they gather more information on many countries than their respective governments, okay? So digital tools are becoming even increasingly important. So to sum up, modernity managed to integrate local ways of living the world into a huge market, but destroying their particularities, coming back to the Descola citation, leading for many people to huge inequalities and the ecological catastrophe that we are facing today. So there are two reactions, to be a bit schematic and too fast here. One is the temptation to unplug from the modernist machine, to avoid surveillance and take care of the local entanglements necessary to sustain human societies, okay, to unplug from the market and to create Notre-Dame-des-Landes in France, or to create isolated zones that are more or less autonomous. However, of course, one may wonder if this disconnection can deal with the global challenges that we face, climate change and the ecological catastrophe. So shouldn't we rather seize control of the digital tools by adapting them to amplify our global regulation capacities while respecting the complexity and diversity of individuals? So we know that digital tools can go into that direction, but can digital tools achieve that? I mean, politically, of course. I mean, we should not be too naive. And also, from an ecological point of view, the planetary limits on rare earth and all that is needed for digital tools is not clearly compatible with their generalization. So we have a tool that could maybe help solve part of the modernity crisis, but okay, it's only a technology here, and we have, of course, to widen the discussion to all the politics and geostrategical arguments. And I'm sure that our two speakers will deal with these complex issues of this complex society, and we have a great discussion after you two talks. So maybe Stéphane, you can introduce our two speakers, or maybe starting with Matthias, who is going to start the webinar, And then we will introduce Dominique Pestre after Matthias. What do you think, Stefan?
Okay, perfect. So we have the pleasure today to have Matthias Schemmel from the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science in Berlin and Dominique Pestre from EHESS. Matthias has been considering I mean, both of them considered the history of science and the link with society and their impact on society. Dominique Pestre has worked extensively, for instance, on the relationship with the militaries. Matthias Schemmel has worked on the history of science in other regions of the world, and in particular in China, and studied the similarities between different settings, but also their differences. And one of the points of interest for us today is how it impacts in the Anthropocene. And Matthias has written recently an article on that topic, and I would like to welcome him now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Pablo, for this invitation. And yeah, let me start with the observation that one way our modern societies have grown more complex surely lies in the role that science has come to play in them. Because for the longest time in history, science, and theoretical science in particular, played a marginal role for production and for social reproduction. So modern society relies on scientific knowledge and its continuous generation more than any other form of society in human history. Starting with developments in the early modern Europe, scientific knowledge became increasingly intertwined with processes of societal reproduction and development. And so in the course and in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, science played an increasing role in production and in fact in sustaining human society. Think for example of the chemical fertilizers and how they enable population growth. So we are presently in a situation in which it is decisive, science is decisive for the survival of humankind, and decisive in both its destructive and in its constructive potentials. The climate catastrophe is an apt and a crucial example here. So it is science that amplified human impact on the planet's ecology to an extent that becomes threatening to the species. And at the same time, science is surely needed to understand the processes involved, effectively respond to them, and even plays a role in developing possible alternative ways of living and organizing society. So in view of these developments, it seems irresponsible to leave science to its own devices, to let it grow naturally, so to speak. Only that nature here designates economic and societal circumstances, or maybe also an internal dynamics of development. So if it's a matter of life and death, it seems to be reasonable to try to anticipate future developments, to try to direct science into desired directions, in other words, to plan science. And this idea is not new, of course. It may appear particularly urgent to us in view of the global crisis we are facing, but it was a consideration and to a certain extent a policy and a reality already in the second half of the last century. And this holds not only for the state socialist societies of the Eastern Bloc or China, where attempts were made to bind science more closely to the practical needs of society. It also holds for the West, where groups emerged and institutions were established that pursued futurology, strategic studies, peace research, the study of global ecology and world economy, and science studies with societal goals in mind. Well-known examples are as diverse as the RAND Corporation in the US. I think there was an earlier event where Thomas Turnbull talked about it, or the Club of Rome, for instance.
Yep.
So the goals were often linked to governments, the military,
Matthias, you turned off your microphone.
Yeah. And Pablo, shall you use the slides or?
I mean, I'm waiting, Matthias, for...
Yeah, I will tell you when the next slide comes.
Okay.
Yes.
I didn't turn it off though, but I experienced that before. I think if somebody else says something, it turns off itself. So from
Really?
when on did you miss me? I was talking
No,
about...
just a few seconds before, so
okay,
it's okay.
no problem. So I was talking about these institutions that explore the possibilities and necessities for future societies from an inclusive and global perspective. And one of these institutions has been the short-lived Max-Planck-Institut for the study of the living conditions of the scientific technical world, clumsy name, which existed through the 70s, the 1970s. The founding director was the physicist and philosopher Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and later Jürgen Habermas joined the institute as a second director. And at that institute, a group of researchers working on science studies under von Weizsäcker, and now you can go to the next slide, they demanded the development of a theory of the social constitution of science, which explains in what sense science and society are interrelated, so that a selective determination of the former by the latter is in fact possible. They formulated the so-called finalization thesis, claiming that parts of modern science had reached a stage of theoretical development or closure, that they can now be further developed according to societal needs, rather than following an inner logic of scientific development. These theses and the controversy that arose around it at the time brings us to the central problem when directing science for the common good is under discussion. Namely, on one hand, one may ask, can science be planned at all? Can it be directed without being destroyed or hampered at least? Isn't science all about freedom of research and creativity? Doesn't creativity mean unpredictability? But then on the other hand, isn't science de facto already directed? I mean, the ongoing COVID crisis shows how quickly science can be directed into certain directions and have results. And even if this is not always for the general good of society at large, at least for national strategic or economic special interests, there's a lot of direction, like funding and defunding, science policy, the influence of multinational corporations who commission and finance a large amount of the science that is actually done. So surely one particular aspect of the complexity of modern societies relying on science is that science is neither an isolated system, independent of and separable from society as a whole, nor a social activity like any other that can be completely reduced to the social conditions of its existence. In its social, material, and cognitive dimensions, science is both an integral part of society and a subsystem with its own internal dynamic. And for any attempt to plan or direct science, it is therefore important to understand these different dimensions of science and their mutual dependencies, their entanglement in the long-term development of science. And it is here where I think that the history of science becomes an important knowledge resource to address the current questions. A theoretically informed long-term history of science under a global perspective that explains fundamental aspects of the development of knowledge in their interaction with society. Only in this way, I would like to argue, can we adequately take into account the internal complexities of the knowledge system that is modern science, and also the complexities of its societal embedding and of its interaction with society at large. And I would like to illustrate the insights one may obtain from such research by highlighting three characteristics of science that I consider relevant in our context. And they are on the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So science generates a surplus knowledge. The scientific image of nature is mediated by technology, and new knowledge emerges from the integration of heterogeneous domains. So I will go through them now and give some examples. Next slide, please. Science generates surplus knowledge. No, that's fine. The one with the highlighting is good enough for the moment. So science is different from any attempt to solve practical problems directly. This is already clear from the concept of applied science. If science was the direct solution of practical problems, it would not have to be applied in order to solve problems. Science can be and has to be applied to become practical because it generates knowledge that is not immediately directed at a specific practical purpose. To make this point clear, let us go back to the very beginnings of science. Let us consider the earliest documented occurrences of what may be called supra-utilitarian mathematics, that is, a symbolic activity not directly aimed at tackling practical problems. And now you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this dates back to the Mesopotamian scribes of the early second millennium BCE. The administrative demands of early Mesopotamian city-states brought about a class of scribes who were engaged in a broad range of surveying, planning, and taxation activities. They used science incised into clay tablets to do their accounting. These symbolic means, proto-numbers and a kind of proto-geometry, had thus developed in the practical context of administration, an administration that had become necessary in connection with the development of ever larger settlements, the early city-states. Internal difficulties in the administrative processes, such as converting between the various systems of weights and measures, eventually brought about the development of the place value number system of old Babylonian mathematics. The system and its application implied a more general concept of number than the context-specific counting systems that it emerged from and that were further used parallel to it. We thus see that it is not the case that numbers are invented and only then applied to practical contexts. Rather, abstract numerals emerge from the practice of administrative calculation and the subsequent systematic exploration of the knowledge structures inherent in the symbolic means for land and labor management. So the activities of the scribes and land surveyors departed from the direct application to practical problems of society and evolved into an exploration of the structural implications of the material and symbolic means of mental labor, a process that eventually brought about a lot of surplus knowledge, Babylonian mathematics, including a more abstract concept of number. Similar developments must have taken place more or less independently in other early civilizations in Egypt, India, China, and Mesoamerica, but they are not as well documented as in Mesopotamia with the durable clay tablets. We may consider this to be one of the many origins of science, and please go to the next slide. Then we have a quote: "We may speak of science if the goal of a certain social activity consists in elaborating the potentials of the material tools of mental labor, which are otherwise used in planning of work apart from such goals, and solely for the purpose of gaining knowledge about the possible outcome." So our example illustrates how science emerges from systematic reflection on non-scientific practical forms of knowledge. But owing to its explorative character, that is the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, science cannot be reduced to the practical knowledge underlying it. Science produces a surplus of knowledge which is not practical to begin with. The surplus knowledge has to be applied in order to become practical again. Over the course of history, the production of surplus knowledge and its applications bring about a deeply structured body of scientific knowledge. Only think of the central role in science of arithmetic and geometry, whose practical origins we have just seen, and of later branches of mathematics which built on them. Another prominent example from much later times is that of electrodynamics. Surplus knowledge acquired in institutions devoted to basic research and based on technological developments made possible by the growing chemical industry. in particular the electric battery, electromagnetic phenomena, were systematically explored and theoretically described long before radio transmission and other path-breaking applications were envisaged. So this brings me to my next point, namely, and you can turn to the next slide, the scientific image of nature is mediated by technology. The scientific experience of nature is almost always mediated by technology. This is obvious for the example of electrodynamics that I just mentioned, but it applies to all natural sciences, so-called natural sciences, even including biology. In fact, one may understand the enormous expansion of natural knowledge that constituted the early modern scientific revolution as resulting from the use of the instruments employed in processes of production for the sole purpose of acquiring knowledge. So labor tools become knowledge production tools or are adapted and modified for this purpose. This means exploration not only of symbolic tools of labor, as we have seen in the Mesopotamian case, but also of other material means of production, namely technology and instruments. The technologically mediated view of nature is sometimes presented as a particularly Western view that has spread across the world through colonialism and expansionism, and also through an increasingly globally competitive economy. But we find parallel developments in other societies. Not only are ancient Greek mechanics, optics, and geometry founded on technology-based experiences, we find similar independent developments in other societies, such as China. And now you can go to the next slide. Thank you. This is an excerpt from the so-called Mohis Canon, written around 300 BCE. The Mohis school was one of the larger philosophical schools of ancient China, and in its late phase brought about a corpus of texts reflecting very rigorous ethical, logical, and scientific thinking. Some of the passages present us with very striking parallels to the Greek case. We have considerations of levers and pulleys, concave and convex mirrors, and camera obscura. I mentioned this ancient Chinese example to point out that the technologically mediated view of nature did not only emerge once in human history, but appears to be something more general or universal, of course, given certain particular societal circumstances. The technologically affine character of science is closely related to its present role as a force of production. The historical processes that promoted the theoretization of the knowledge of practitioners in the long run also brought about the conditions for such theoretical knowledge itself to become a factor of production. But a large part of the surplus knowledge of early modern science was not of practical relevance, and it sometimes took centuries for it to become so. This means that a long forerun was needed before science became to play the crucial role it does in our modern societies. A particular type of knowledge economy was needed to secure sustained support of science, even if it did not immediately fulfill its promise of practical improvement. By knowledge economy, I do not mean an economy that relies on knowledge, but I mean the economy of knowledge, the way or the ways knowledge is produced, acquired, distributed, received, evaluated, handed down, and so on. In early modern Europe, we may speak of a self-reinforcing feedback loop between different forms of knowledge and between the knowledge economy and the material economy. That such knowledge economy is not a matter of course can again be seen by comparing early modern Europe with the case of contemporaneous China, where certain types of surplus knowledge were not furthered in the same way. Through the presence of Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century China and their cooperation with Chinese scholar officials on matters of science and statecraft, large parts of contemporaneous European scientific knowledge were brought to China at the time. This was ranging from Euclidean geometry to the latest telescopic observations of Galileo. And if you go to the next slide, yeah, here we see an excerpt on the law of the lever, for instance, in a book from 1627, presenting Western mechanics to Chinese readers for the first time. But while the Chinese side was quick in adapting knowledge into their own knowledge economy, large fields of surplus knowledge, such as theoretical mechanics, did not take root in contemporaneous China. This shows the extent to which not only the actual scientific knowledge, but its societal embedding plays a role for the future development of science. In this case, in particular, the role of institutions who sustain the production of surplus knowledge, which in Europe were the academies, the universities, and later also more specialized institutions dedicated to research. From the Chinese perspective, the rejection of certain types of surplus knowledge was totally rational. This knowledge did indeed constitute a surplus. The question is why the early modern European knowledge economy did maintain it. So the famous Needham question of why modern science did not take root in China in early modern times can be reformulated as to why it was maintained in Europe, although in so many instances and for such a long time it did not hold its promise of usefulness. In any case, it is important to note that it was not a question of different mentalities or incompatible images of nature. As the Mohis example shows, surplus knowledge producing and technology-affine types of theoretical science were not impossible altogether in China. Rather, societal circumstances, economic and institutional, the different knowledge economies seem to play a role here. And starting in the second half of the 19th century, under radically changed power relations and economic conditions, modern science indeed began to be successfully adapted in China, which has now become a leading contributor to globalized science. And if you go to the next slide, that's an image of a Chinese supercomputer, and I think it may serve as an illustration of this role that China has taken on. So summing up what I have tried to say so far, scientific knowledge is not directly goal-oriented, as practical forms of knowledge are, but is generated in the process of exploring the symbolic and material means of a society at a given time in history. What science is possible at a given time then crucially depends on the material and symbolic resources available in a given society, what instruments, what materials, but also what formalisms, what symbol systems. Today, of course, computers and their respective computational powers, as well as computational methods and algorithms, are among the material and symbolic means. But it also crucially depends on the knowledge economy, particularly the way knowledge is produced and disseminated in institutions. Now, working on the basis of the idea that scientific knowledge emerges from the exploration and reflection on symbolic and material means given at a time, let me add one more characteristic of scientific knowledge production that is revealed in a long-term history of science and of some relevance here, I think. Can you go to the next slide? Yes, it's the new knowledge that emerges from the integration of heterogeneous domains. This is quite obvious for the early modern case, when the integration of the knowledge of engineers and mathematical practitioners with a theoretical tradition of natural philosophy brought about modern science. Or to use a more concrete example, when Newton's integration of the terrestrial mechanics a la Galileo and the celestial knowledge captured in Kepler's astronomy brought about the beginnings of classical mechanics. Today's science is differentiated and divided in disciplines and subdisciplines, which are separated conceptually as well as institutionally. It is often at the borderlines of disciplines and subdisciplines that innovation and processes of the reorganization of knowledge take place. For the case of physics, we can state, for instance, that the two fundamental theories of 20th century physics, relativity and quantum theory, emerged at the borderlines of the subdisciplines of late 19th century physics. If you go to the next slide, we can see there is an example, special relativity, which emerged at the borderline of mechanics and electrodynamics and was an attempt to integrate their frameworks. But then if you go to the next slide, this was for the price that gravitation, which was considered part of mechanics, dropped out of the scheme because it didn't fit into special relativity. And then going to the next slide again, you get general relativity as an integration of gravitation with special relativity. So we see here processes of integration and disintegration of knowledge fields that promote scientific development and reorganization of knowledge. And in fact, I think that these processes apply more generally, not only to the case of modern physics. In particular, they also apply to the way we have to approach the challenges at the borderline of science and society. So the heterogeneous fields that come together here are not the subfields within one discipline, as in the case of physics, but come from natural sciences as well as the humanities and the social sciences. We need knowledge of the planetary ecological system, a complex biophysical system of which human global society and its accelerated growth are an integral part. This is a joint task for the natural and social sciences and the humanities. We need knowledge of how transformations work and how innovations can be directed and then spread in society. Likewise, a joint task for science and the humanities. In these endeavors, we will surely need an iterative exchange between qualitative analysis and modeling. For instance, through the formalization of selected insights from historical and social research. And let me end here for the time being and yeah, go on in, afterwards in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthias. It was extremely interesting. And I suggest we start with Dominique and then go in a global discussion.
Okay.
So Dominique will speak in French, and the English translation will be shown. Is that right, Pablo?
Yeah. It's an approximate English translation, okay? Automatic. Which is a good example of numerical tool, by the way. Okay. Dominique, you should turn your micro on. Yep. It's okay now.
It works?
Yep.
OK. Bon, donc merci, bonjour à tous. En introduction, et pour ne pas perdre trop de temps, parce que je voulais dire pas mal de choses, je rappellerai ce que vise le séminaire qui nous accueille. Il vise à analyser, si je le cite, les relations entre monde numérique et société complexe, entre Digital Revolution and Complex Societies. Bon, je vois l'intérêt du sujet qui est évident, qui est essentiel. Il s'agit de lier, si je comprends cette phrase, de corréler, de regarder ensemble révolution numérique et ses capacités et ses forces, mais aussi, je pense, ses limites et ses dangers, et société actuelle. Mais dans l'intitulé du séminaire, il y a un sous-titre qui réoriente, à mon avis, la conversation. Il dit « Is planning through numbers the way to control our complex society ?» Ce qui me semble un projet un peu différent. Ici, le séminaire semble se demander si et comment la révolution digitale pourrait aider à contrôler, ou peut-être de façon un peu plus neutre, on pourrait dire à gouverner les sociétés. Et ce sujet est lui aussi digne d'attention, mais ce ne sont pas exactement les mêmes sujets. Alors, face à ceci, j'avais envie de faire trois choses après avoir lu en détail ce que j'ai reçu comme papier. Je reviendrai d'abord sur les termes qui me semblent très polysémiques de complexe et de complexité. Lorsque j'en ai parlé avec Stéphane, c'est apparu tout le temps. Nous ne savions pas si nous employions les termes de la même façon. Donc, ils sont centraux dans la présentation et je voudrais commencer à les décomposer un tout petit peu, à ouvrir quelques boîtes noires pour ouvrir la discussion. Je reviendrai ensuite sur ce qu'on pourrait appeler la philosophie politique du sous-titre. Et je souhaiterais le pousser dans ses retranchements jusqu'au bout, afin de nous permettre collectivement d'aller au fond des choses. Et je demande donc à Stéphane et Pablo de me pardonner si j'utilise leur texte comme un punching ball. Et finalement, je chercherai à décrire à ma façon ce qui me semble faire la complexité des sociétés des 4 dernières ou 5 dernières décennies. Voilà ce que je vais faire. Donc, revenons d'abord sur la polysémie des mots. Un problème complexe, dans la langue courante, j'ai vérifié dans divers dictionnaires, veut d'abord dire compliqué, mais aussi qui contient des éléments combinés d'une manière qui n'est pas immédiatement claire, mais encore dans un certain nombre de dictionnaires, difficile à cerner du fait de la complexité. Bon, on tourne toujours un petit peu en rond dans les définitions de dictionnaires. Alors, complexité à son tour a des sens multiples. Je prends les biologistes pour commencer. Bon, je cite des définitions standards que vous trouverez à peu près partout. On pourrait. Bon, voilà. Donc, la première, si par système complexe, on entend une combinaison de différentes parties organisées en structure et possédant une dynamique propre, alors tout être vivant est un système complexe. Voilà une autre phrase que j'ai piochée. La biologie occupe une place de choix dans l'étude de la complexité. Chaque discipline dit ça, hein, donc les biologistes le disent aussi, c'est normal. Car tous les systèmes vivants, même les plus simples, sont des systèmes complexes. Le cerveau des vertébrés supérieurs étant probablement le système le plus complexe qui soit. Donc, si je résume, la complexité renvoie pour la biologie à une combinaison de parties différentes, mais qui sont organisées en structure et qui sont dotées d'une dynamique propre. Voilà ce qui définit un ensemble complexe. L'humain étant évidemment le stade suprême de la complexité. Alors pour l'informatique, là je connais très mal, mais j'ai trouvé dans Wikipédia en tapant ces mots-là, je pense que ça conviendra, la théorie de la complexité dans le domaine de l'informatique théorique étudie formellement la quantité de ressources en temps, espace, mémoire, etc., dont a besoin un algorithme pour résoudre un problème algorithmique. Il s'agit donc d'étudier la difficulté intrinsèque des problèmes, de les organiser par classe de complexité et d'étudier les relations entre ces classes. Donc ici, ça me semble un peu différent. L'idée, c'est que l'échelle de complexité est ici un outil d'évaluation de la faisabilité d'un calcul. Et il n'est pas question, par exemple, de qualifier des réalités ontologiques, la complexité intrinsèque d'un organisme vivant, par exemple. Donc là, avec complexité, on part peut-être dans quelque chose d'un peu différent. Pour les sciences sociales, bon, je rapporte ici principalement ce qu'en a dit Edgar Morin, qui est un de ceux qui a le plus parlé de ça. C'est mon résumé, hein, bien sûr, puisque c'est des livres entiers chez Morin. Les systèmes complexes, première chose qu'il dit toujours, sont fortement interactifs et peuvent être de toute nature, physico-chimiques, biologiques, écologiques, économiques, sociaux, cognitifs, naturels, etc. Les interactions, tiens, il manque un S, dans les systèmes complexes sont essentiellement de nature relationnelle et cybernétique. Le mot de cybernétique vient du fait qu'il a beaucoup écrit dans les années 70 sur ces questions. Certaines propriétés sont de caractère holistique, dans le sens qu'elles concernent l'ensemble du système comme entité unitaire. Mais certaines propriétés émergentes de la même façon n'ont d'existence et de sens qu'au niveau du système comme totalité. Finalement, l'existence de lois générales n'implique pas que les systèmes soient déterministes ou prédictibles. Au contraire, les systèmes sont très sensibles au jeu entre contingences locales et nécessités relationnelles. En bref, une proposition qui n'est pas celle-là aux antipodes de ce qu'on a dit pour la biologie, ce qui ne me surprend pas, à vrai dire, hein, puisque voilà, bon, ce sont des choses qui étudient des objets qu'ils ont dans la nature ou dans le social. On cherche à qualifier des ensembles unitaires de tous ordres de manière ontologique. J'avais quelque chose sur le management des entreprises, c'est très intéressant, mais je propose qu'on saute parce qu'on n'a pas énormément de temps. Et donc, je voudrais conclure sur cette affaire, sur cette première discussion sur complexe et complexité. Je dirais, la notion académique de complexité, comme celle de l'adjectif complexe dans la langue commune, offre une grande variété de sens. Et je crois que celui de la biologie et des sciences humaines est pour moi, en tous les cas, le plus heuristique pour le problème tel que je le vois que vous avez définies dans le séminaire. Provisoirement, je garderai donc ce sens dans ce qui suit. Bon, second point que je voulais regarder, je vous l'avais dit, c'est revenir sur ce qu'on pourrait appeler la philosophie politique qui soutient le sous-titre du séminaire. Je le redonne, planning, hein, c'est pas un mot, c'est un mot fort, ça. Hein. Through numbers, bon là on comprend ce que ça veut dire, as a way to control society. Bon, cette manière de s'exprimer, si on la prend au pied de la lettre, ce que je ne vais pas faire par la suite, donne une vision assez dure du gouvernement des hommes et des choses. Elle rappelle aussi le modèle du despote éclairé, promu par les philosophes des Lumières, et elle paraît, comme proposition théorique, assez unilatérale. On sait en effet combien il y a de manières différentes et toutes utiles de penser les sociétés, de penser leur complexité, de penser les liens de dépendance, de penser le pouvoir, etc. Bon, je donne quelques noms. Marx, Weber, Bourdieu, Latour, ou pourquoi pas Margaret Thatcher, qui nous a expliqué qu'il n'y avait pas de société, mais seulement des individus, et que parler en termes sociaux est une erreur. Alors, pour avancer et me décaler un peu par rapport à ça, je voudrais reprendre la réflexion en commençant par quelques remarques sur révolution numérique et contrôle des populations, puisque contrôle est le mot qui nous a été présenté. Alors, première chose que je dirais, il est vrai, il est très vrai que les outils digitaux sont des outils majeurs de contrôle, de suivi et de repérage des individus, et tout particulièrement des individus déviants. Alors, on peut penser à la NSA aux États-Unis ou tous ses équivalents ailleurs, ou aux outils de suivi des individus en Chine, où on est relativement avancé. Je dirais, en bref, sur ce point, les outils numériques peuvent être, je ne sais pas qu'ils sont, ils peuvent être de vrais outils de contrôle au sens strict du terme. Deuxième point, il est aussi très très vrai que ces outils digitaux sont d'efficaces outils de repérage des individus dans un tas d'aspects de leur vie. Par exemple, leur consommation. Et la publicité ciblée peut devenir centrale dans le monde du commerce. Ces outils digitaux peuvent donc permettre de peser sur les comportements, alors on s'écarte un petit peu de contrôle cette fois, via par exemple des incitations ciblées, en temps réel. Hein. Bon, dans ces premiers cas, on pourra en donner d'autres, hein, on peut dire qu'on sait, parce que ça c'est le point qui m'importe, on sait qui contrôle, en l'occurrence l'État ou les entreprises, et le sens brutal du mot contrôle est parfaitement adapté. Mais je pense d'une certaine façon, j'espère qu'entre nous ici dans ce séminaire, nous ne souhaiterions pas généraliser ce mode-là de contrôle social et le donner comme norme du bon gouvernement. Ce qui nous amène à la partie suivante qui part de l'idée de planning. Bon, je suppose, parce qu'il faut aller directement, il faut être concret et aller directement au cœur des choses, je pense que ce qui préoccupe Stéphane et Pablo lorsqu'ils emploient ces termes, c'est la question des essais de contrôle du changement climatique. Je pense que le mot de contrôle est venu de là, et donc je vais m'intéresser un peu en détail à cette histoire du changement climatique et de la manière dont nous le prenons, y compris par les outils numériques, mais pas seulement. Alors, je rappellerai d'abord, parce que ça c'est un point qui me tient à cœur, je l'ai souvent écrit, la lutte contre le changement climatique n'est qu'une toute petite fraction des problèmes rencontrés dans les questions environnementales. Alors qu'on fait comme si c'était équivalent, que le changement climatique, en gros, c'était défendre l'environnement. C'est faux. La gestion de l'environnement dans ses diverses dimensions est autrement complexe à évaluer, puisque nous ne pouvons construire pour tous les problèmes d'environnement une métrique unique et simple, comme c'est le cas avec la quantité de CO2 dans l'atmosphère pour le changement climatique. Donc c'est plus facile numériquement ensuite de gérer. Bon, si je précise, gérer les forêts au nord et au sud, réguler les pesticides, penser le maintien de la biodiversité, penser les problèmes spécifiques des zones arides ou des zones humides, etc., etc., etc. Il y a des centaines de choses de cet ordre. Ceci constitue un ensemble de problèmes qui ne supportent ni une approche, ni une norme unique d'évaluation. D'où la difficulté de tenir globalement la gestion environnementale. Donc, en bref, à mon sens, le changement climatique est un cas d'école simple, peut-être trop simple pour pouvoir servir de modèle aux autres. Les autres cas sont infiniment plus compliqués, et j'ai pris l'environnement, mais on va l'étendre à d'autres, et sont à l'heure actuelle totalement ingérables numériquement. Alors, pour le changement climatique, maintenant j'y reviens lui-même. Je reconnais évidemment de très gros progrès depuis le rapport de Rome de 1972 dans notre compréhension de comment évolue Gaïa. Mais là surgit un second problème, et je pense qu'il faut en être aussi assez conscient. Au-delà des constats qui sont réalisés par les physiciens, les chimistes, les biologistes et les modélisateurs de ces mondes physiques, constants qui semblent assez robustes et fiables et qui nous disent que, par exemple, il y a un phénomène anthropique de réchauffement climatique. Ceci est, au-delà de ces constats néanmoins, ce qui est dit des solutions sociales et politiques qui peuvent être ou qui doivent être adoptées est en revanche terriblement médiocre, court, limité et surtout très biaisé. C'est la partie 3, si vous voulez, des rapports du GIEC, et ça c'est ce que je connais le mieux. Moi, je connais moins la physique maintenant, mais je connais bien ces textes-là, et là, on peut vraiment discuter de ce que racontent ces textes. D'accord? Et les choses sont ainsi précisément pour la raison qui nous occupe dans ce séminaire. Les intrications de l'économique, du social, du politique, du naturel sont tellement nombreuses, variées et à multiples feedbacks. En bref, elles sont tellement compliquées, peut-être complexes, je ne sais pas, que personne ne sait comment cela fonctionne comme ensemble, comme unité organique, disent les biologistes. Et les solutions proposées, si vous regardez le rapport du GIEC, ou ce que vous avez dans les conférences des Nations Unies, etc., les solutions qui sont proposées dérivent en général de terribles simplifications, en général des modèles économiques le plus souvent, et qui précisément n'intègrent jamais la complexité dont nous parlons. Donc les points aveugles sont extrêmement multiples, certains sont massifs, ils sont bien connus. Je les avais notés entre parenthèses en dessous, on va les sauter parce qu'on verra dans la discussion, on pourra y revenir. Donc tu avances un petit peu, tu avances, voilà, I will conclude. Je conclurai ainsi cette première partie si vous voulez, même dans le cas du changement climatique, qui est le plus simple. Je vois mal comment planning through numbers could be the way to, alors je ne parle même pas de contrôle, mais to help society, car les modèles développés pour fournir les solutions politiques et sociales sont beaucoup trop simplistes et partiaux et sont incapables de tenir la complexité sociale, économique et politique. Mais aussi car le problème est social et politique de part en part, ce n'est pas qu'une affaire de représentation. Et je crois que Paul Ricoeur a entièrement raison lorsqu'il écrit, et je lis, je l'avais mis en exergue de mon livre, celui-là, je ne sais pas si on le voit là, Science, argent et politique, que j'ai publié en 2003, et qui aborde toutes ces questions. Hein. Et voilà ce que disait Paul Ricoeur en 91, une démocratie n'est pas un régime politique sans conflit, mais un régime dans lequel les conflits sont ouverts, reconnus et en outre négociables. Sous ce régime, le conflit n'est pas un accident, le conflit n'est pas un malheur, il est simplement l'expression du caractère non décidable de façon scientifique et de façon dogmatique, c'est-à-dire dans les valeurs du bien public. La discussion politique est sans conclusion obligatoire, bien qu'elle ne soit pas, évidemment, sans décision. Je pense que, fondamentalement, Ricoeur met bien le point sur un problème qui, cette fois, dépasse la question du lien de la révolution numérique à la complexité du social, mais bien de ce qu'est la nature du politique que lui, en tous les cas, revendique et que moi, je soutiens. Bon, ça, c'était en gros la première partie qui discutait en quelque sorte le cadre du séminaire, parce que je voulais attirer l'attention sur un certain nombre de questions. Je pense que j'en ai soulevé quelques-unes. Donc la deuxième partie, si vous voulez, je vais revenir sur ce qui fait la complexité des dernières décennies dans l'ordre social, et donc aussi économique et politique. Ce sont des choses qui ne sont pas séparables, ou alors on va vraiment resimplifier à nouveau beaucoup trop. Ma description, je le remarque, je l'accepte, porte essentiellement sur l'Europe et les Amériques, une partie de l'Afrique parce que je connais un petit peu ça, je ne connais rien à l'Asie et donc je n'ai pas grand-chose à en dire, et elle sera, j'en suis désolé, consternante de simplisme parce que je vais devoir être extrêmement rapide. Mais le petit livre que je mentionnais là, Science, argent et politique, prendre le temps de le développer beaucoup plus longuement. Enfin bon, depuis j'ai écrit d'autres choses, mais au moins ça existe. Alors j'évoquerai 3 points, simplement 3. Premièrement, la multiplicité des sources de savoir et la modestie que les sciences devraient avoir en ces matières sociales, politiques et économiques, car ces sciences-là, nos sciences, c'est-à-dire j'appelle science ici ce que font les académiques, si vous voulez, rien d'autre, elles ont des limites très très fortes. Deuxième point que je regarderai, la transformation profonde du monde social depuis un demi-siècle, et notamment l'émergence d'une société, d'un monde beaucoup plus disparate, beaucoup plus individualisé dans ses valeurs, beaucoup plus éclaté, beaucoup plus à plat, ce qui soutient d'une certaine façon l'idée d'une plus grande complexité organique de ces sociétés. Et enfin, je dirais quelques mots très brièvement du phénomène de globalisation économique, parce qu'il est central, notamment dans les solutions que vous souhaitez adopter. Si vous ne prenez pas ça en compte, vous pouvez toujours parler. Et de l'inversion des pouvoirs effectifs qu'il a créés au profit des grandes entreprises multinationales, et ce que cela implique quant aux possibilités d'agir pour le bien commun. Alors, point 1, d'abord, à propos des sciences, et je dis bien parce qu'on a eu la discussion, le point avec Matthias juste avant, moi ici je l'emploie dans un sens des savoirs produits dans les mondes académiques, c'est vraiment un sens très restreint, c'est tout ce que je veux dire. Alors, je commencerai d'abord par des remarques épistémologiques, à savoir, il convient de ne jamais oublier les limites de ces savoirs scientifiques, de nos savoirs, des miens, des vôtres, des catégories que nous utilisons, des preuves que nous construisons, des calculs et montées en généralité parfois hâtifs que nous faisons. Le problème est que, en général, pour faire science, et là je connais mieux la physique et la biologie qu'autre chose, pour faire science et contrôler parfaitement son sujet et ses paramètres, il faut précisément délimiter le sujet et donc simplifier son problème et mettre beaucoup de choses de côté. La simplification est le point de départ de toutes les sciences de laboratoire. Ce qui n'aide pas, évidemment, pour la gestion des problèmes complexes dans les conclusions qu'elle tire. Ceci conduit d'ailleurs souvent à des concurrences entre disciplines, puisqu'elles ne prennent pas les choses de la même façon. Dans ce livre dont je parlais, je regarde par exemple entre toxicologues et épidémiologistes de terrain sur les affaires de santé publique, pourquoi ils n'arrivent pas à se mettre d'accord, ils ne se comprennent presque pas. Les disciplines tentent aussi souvent à s'ignorer les unes les autres, chacune étant en général assez sûre de sa supériorité, la supériorité de ses approches et de ses cadrages. Là, on pourrait développer la polémique sur l'âge de la Terre au 19e. J'ai noté ça parce que c'est un exemple que j'ai toujours pris avec mes étudiants. Lord Kelvin, qui est le plus grand physicien de la seconde moitié du 19e siècle, très certainement, et ses batailles avec les géologues, étant entendu qu'à partir de ses calculs, Lord Kelvin, et il parle en tant que physicien, donc c'est lui qui a raison. Je veux dire, c'était évident que c'est lui qui a raison, arrive à des chiffres qui sont de l'ordre de 20 ou 30 millions d'années d'existence de la Terre. Alors les géologues lui expliquent que c'est pas possible, on en est dans des centaines de millions d'années, mais bon, voilà. Et une incompréhension totale entre les deux disciplines, et ça tient à ce cadrage des questions. En bref, si je le dis encore autrement, la science n'est peut-être pas la science que nous produisons nous, j'entends bien, c'est de ça dont je parle, je ne parle pas avec un grand S. Les sciences, les savoirs que nous produisons nous ne sont peut-être pas aussi universels qu'on le pense. La science, les sciences, nos sciences, c'est un ensemble de savoirs parallèles et non ordonnés qui sont très efficaces technologiquement, mais qui sont en termes de savoir extrêmement partiels, limités et d'une certaine façon toujours locaux. Je voulais parler de la théorie des couleurs de Newton, on y reviendra si ça intéresse quelqu'un, sinon on laisse tomber. Alors il faut faire aussi quelques remarques sur, pas seulement épistémologiques, mais je dirais cette fois des remarques sociologiques ou politiques. La place des sciences en société. Pareil, je parle de la période contemporaine, je ne remonte pas au-delà du 19e pour l'instant, après on aurait d'autres cas de figure. Alors, d'abord, nous ne vivons pas, nos sciences, nous-mêmes, nous ne vivons pas dans un monde à part et pur. Quand tout le monde en est d'accord, j'imagine, on est toujours pris, et surtout si vous faites de la physique, de la biologie, de l'informatique, j'imagine, entre développement technologique, innovation, choix industriels, intérêts nationaux et intérêts militaires. Les continuités, là, sont extrêmement strictes. Et ces liens entre ces différents domaines sont beaucoup plus étroits aujourd'hui qu'autrefois. Alors là, je l'ai détaillé dans des tas de livres, depuis les années 80 pour être précis, et cela pèse partout dans le monde sur la nature de la recherche, sur la nature de l'activité que nous avons. En général, hein, il y a toujours des exceptions. Et ces sciences qui sont part à des technosciences industrialisées se pensent souvent, et c'est très important pour les affaires de changement climatique, extrêmement démiurges et ne sont pas naturellement prudentes. Et ça concerne peut-être ce qu'il en est de la révolution numérique. Historiquement, si je précise, la contestation de l'aveuglement des sciences à nombre de questions apparaît, se radicalise fortement vers 1970. Et c'est dû au fait que c'est à cette époque que sont créées un grand nombre des ONG environnementales. D'accord ? Et elles contestent les sciences officielles et leur simplification injustifiée sur la manière dont sont prises les questions environnementales. De là l'idée, qui est maintenant assez établie, j'imagine, que la variété des types de savoir et de cadrage des questions dans l'espace et dans le temps, parce que si vous prenez des temporalités différentes ou des espaces différents, d'un seul coup les cadrages changent et le résultat de ce que vous décrivez comme un savoir change, et bien que cette variété est une bonne chose et qu'il faut essayer de penser leur complémentarité, qui est peut-être un des meilleurs moyens pour attraper un peu de la complexité et de l'intrication des problèmes. D'où aussi, je vous le rappelle, ça va très vite, hein, vous comprenez bien que j'avance à très grandes enjambées, vers les années 2000, d'où aussi l'idée de participation, de consultation citoyenne. Donc là, on rejoint en partie ce que je lisais tout à l'heure. C'est pas par hasard que c'est en 91 que Ricoeur écrivait son texte, hein, parce que ça se passe à ce moment-là. Ce qui apparaît autour des grands accidents industriels et la gestion des pollutions et des maladies environnementales. Alors, il faut penser à l'affaire Love Canal, Seveso, Tchernobyl, Bhopal, etc., etc. Et aujourd'hui, évidemment, sous Macron, la conférence sur les politiques du changement climatique. Mais d'où aussi, dans tout ce temps, et ça s'est accentué avec le temps, depuis les années 70, une défiance peut-être croissante des populations vis-à-vis de ce que les scientifiques affirment, et qu'ils affirment souvent, malheureusement pour eux, de façon contradictoire. Alors ça, c'était le premier point, la prudence vis-à-vis de nous-mêmes quand nous énonçons des choses. Maintenant, à propos des transformations récentes des individus, du corps social, des sociétés, voilà ce que je dirais. Un premier trait massif depuis 50 ans, c'est pareil, ça remonte fin des années 60, fin des années 70 par là, et la montée des individualismes dans les mondes sociaux occidentaux, l'apparition de sociétés beaucoup plus plates, moins structurées verticalement, et dans laquelle les itinéraires individuels sont plus nombreux et variés, sont plus respectés et sont plus valorisés dans leurs différences. Le social valorise la différence. Alors, je fais un contraste pour qu'on comprenne. Prenons le compromis des 30 Glorieuses. La France de De Gaulle, si vous voulez, repose sur une régulation des entreprises et du travail, une régulation très forte, dans un cadre national, sous la houlette de l'État, qui lui-même est choisi par des élections et qui est l'acteur légitime dominant sur son territoire. Bon, s'y ajoute, choses qui ont en partie sont beaucoup amoindries, elles aussi depuis, la puissance d'encadrement des autres structures verticales, les églises, notamment en France, par exemple l'Église catholique, les syndicats, qui sont des puissances verticales d'encadrement qui sont très fortes, la télé, je vous rappelle que la télévision était d'État jusqu'à très tard dans le XXe siècle, la presse, etc. Et c'est aussi que les vies ordinaires sont très réglées par le contrôle social. Je pense toujours à ça. Vous reprenez les photos de 1968 qui sont censées être le cœur d'une révolution dans les mœurs. Eh bien, les hommes comme nous, enfin moi en tous les cas, ils ont tous des cheveux courts, ils sont tous en costume, ils sont tous parfaitement clonés. Et je pense que cette verticalité et ce réglage du contrôle social était beaucoup plus puissant. En bref, la structure de ces sociétés est plutôt verticale, avec une cohérence plus clairement systémique qu'aujourd'hui, car les individus sont plus strictement cadrés et définis dans leur rôle par la société. Voilà. Alors aujourd'hui, est-ce qu'on peut faire un contraste? Aujourd'hui, le contrôle social direct est moins grand, ça c'est sûr. Il est toujours du contrôle social, bien sûr, mais il opère en pesant sur les possibles, par exemple. Rappelez-vous les incitations ciblées à consommer que j'ai décrites tout à l'heure. Et le dressage a priori des individus, des pensées, le dressage des pensées, le dressage des corps est beaucoup plus faible qu'il ne l'était dans ma jeunesse à moi. Maintenant, chacun est censé, dans l'ordre discursif, s'entend, avoir droit à sa vie, à son accomplissement, il a le droit à ses désirs, il a le droit à ses choix. Alors maintenant, on peut regarder matériellement la pilule depuis la fin des années 60, la procréation, la revendication des vies sexuelles différentes, la fluidité des genres chez les plus jeunes aujourd'hui, chez mes enfants, c'est extrêmement frappant. Pensez aussi au remodelage des corps, la chirurgie esthétique, aujourd'hui absolument massive. On est à des taux de plusieurs dizaines de pourcents de refabrication des poitrines des jeunes filles en Espagne avant 25 ans. C'est des chiffres monumentaux, d'accord? Finalement, et ceci est plus récent, chacun a droit à sa vérité, ce que renforce la vie en silo des réseaux sociaux. En cela, ce monde social est beaucoup plus difficile à anticiper et modéliser, et les déséquilibres et basculements brutaux qui peuvent survenir, les phénomènes de groupe qui découlent de ces individualismes nouveaux, peuvent être extrêmement grands, ce que montre bien la sociologie électorale. Je n'ai pas le temps d'y revenir, mais ça serait formidable de suivre la sociologie électorale de la plupart des pays, c'est vrai, particulièrement vrai en plan les pays européens, mais c'est même vrai aux États-Unis. Vous avez maintenant une volatilité considérable. D'où l'idée, évidemment, d'une complexité probablement accrue. Bon, finalement, quelques mots sur la globalisation économique comme transformation du monde global, de la géopolitique, des flux financiers et donc du politique. Et je mets tous ces mots parce que si nous ne prenons pas ça en compte, vous ne pouvez pas lutter contre le changement climatique. Il faut être sérieux. Ça, je n'y crois pas une seconde. Alors, la globalisation, c'est quoi? En bref, c'est la victoire des grandes entreprises devenues autonomes des pays et autonomes des États qui ont fait sécession, très largement, qui s'enrichissent dans leur monde à eux, sans scrupule particulier apparemment, et qui propagent l'explosion des inégalités, qui est quand même le fait marquant, le fait négatif marquant de la globalisation. Et ceci, bien sûr, ce phénomène-là est un puissant facteur d'instabilité et de complexité. Je mentionnerai ensuite la perte de pouvoir du politique démocratique. Les États sont devenus très impuissants face au marché financier. Personne n'ose s'opposer directement à eux. Il en résulte une perte de protection que les États offraient et émerge le sentiment qu'il n'est pas de débouché aux politiques, que la politique ne sert à rien, qu'elle ne peut à rien, que l'État fait toujours la même politique et qu'il n'a pas le choix. Finalement, la globalisation produit des populations qui se sentent abandonnées, ça c'est clair au Nord, d'accord, et les effets politiques en sont les vagues populistes. On a donc quelques raisons de redevenir un peu pessimiste et avoir l'impression que certaines des horreurs de l'entre-deux-guerres, fascisme, racisme, violence sur les plus faibles, pourraient revenir. Bon, je vais en rester là, je pourrais parler des heures de tout ceci, mais je dirais seulement que ces transformations rendent la pensée des sociétés très compliquée et la prévision très, très complexe. Je résume. Complexe est un adjectif polysémique, évoluant entre compliqué et relevant de la complexité, ce qui rend toujours la conversation difficile. C'est pour ça que parfois je dis tout simplement compliqué, par exemple. La complexité, avec un L majuscule, est une notion qui, elle aussi, varie selon les disciplines scientifiques. Le sens le plus courant présuppose une structure, un système, une certaine unité. Dans les sciences sociales, la postulation d'unité est discutée. Personnellement, je pense que nos sociétés sont maintenant trop compliquées pour pouvoir affirmer une unité systémique. Bon, bien sûr, Dieu pourrait savoir, lui, mais on n'a pas directement la ligne. Ce peut être utile de postuler une unité symétrique, mais je crois que nous sommes très très loin de pouvoir en formaliser ne serait-ce que quelques éléments et tester des hypothèses numériques, même à minima. C'est pourquoi, ça c'est une petite revendication pour ma boutique, décrire et identifier de façon anthropologique les divers aspects et dimensions de cet ectoplasme que sont aujourd'hui nos sociétés, comme le font les historiens, les sociologues, les politistes, est une stratégie d'enquête. Ça documente, ça montre la complexité, ça n'est peut-être pas très simple d'en déduire quelque chose en termes politiques. Et même dans les cas simples, la lutte contre le changement climatique par exemple, on doit rester prudent avec ce que produisent les outils numériques. Ils se montrent assez efficaces à travers les modélisations pour certains univers physiques simples. Et encore, on a beaucoup de problèmes, hein, il y a beaucoup de choses qu'on ne sait pas, il y a des points de basculement qu'on n'anticipe pas forcément. Mais en tous les cas, ils ne le sont pas pour penser la complexité des activités humaines et la manière de les guider. Même dans ce cas simple, nous sommes très loin de tenir la complexité systémique globale. Ce qui ne veut pas dire que ces travaux sont inutiles, loin s'en faut, je ne dis absolument pas ça. Mais cela ne nous conduira pas forcément à un planning numérique nous permettant de dire comment il faut agir. Car nous sommes intellectuellement, car nous en sommes intellectuellement et techniquement très loin, et peut-être qu'on restera intellectuellement toujours très loin. Je pense que nous ne sommes pas des dieux, c'est un peu ça le problème. Si nous étions des dieux, ça irait mieux. Car les choix relèvent aussi du débat public, donc cette dimension ne peut pas être évacuée, et je pense que ce serait une grave erreur épistémologique autant que politique que de croire ou espérer le contraire. Voilà ce que je voulais dire. Alors c'est un peu dense, mais bon, j'espère que ça a quelque intérêt.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dominique and Matthias. So we have now room for some discussion. I propose to, well, the discussion lead the discussion in English for Matthias.
We could have the discussion in English all the time. It doesn't matter to me.
Okay, great. Okay, so actually the translation by DeepL was not that bad. As a subtitle to your talk, I think it was pretty effective.
Thank you.
Okay.
I will read it.
Okay. Okay, so maybe I can start with just a remark to what Dominique said before launching the discussion, is that maybe what we had in mind as as complexity, I think that it's a very fuzzy term, and I think keep complicated is enough for a discussion. We don't really need to go into the details, I think, of the subtleties of complicated and complex for the moment. I think it's not the main point. However, a more important point is about the digital tools, because as far as I understand, you took them as models, as numerical models, as for example, climate models that predict some heating, or the IPCC digital models and numerical models, or the epidemiological models that I quoted earlier in the discussion that were quite effective to predict the third wave in France, even if Macron says that they were wrong. Okay, so I think this is one possible meaning of digital tools as numerical models. What we had in mind, maybe with Stéphane, is more a logistical or a coordination tool. Okay, so we don't think that digital tools, at least this is what I also published in the Société ne se laisse pas mettre en équation. We agree that the society is too complex to be predicted or modeled, but digital tools can be a good tool to coordinate people. You know, if you take examples like Wikipedia that allow people to gather, to put together information and produce a whole that is more than the parts, if you want, and or tools that can be even logistical, just to track the CO2 emissions, for example. You know, so you don't need to have digital tools able to predict for digital tools to be important in a complex society. You see, I think that maybe there was some misunderstanding about digital tools. Maybe if you can answer to that, Dominique, as a first precision, and before starting the discussion.
No, I'm absolutely aware that there are many kinds of digital tools. I mentioned two in my talks. Not the one you mentioned about helping coordinate people. That's something interesting. I'm not in mind when writing this text. But I talk about models, climate model in particular, the IPCC work. And I was also thinking of these tools that follow people in real time all the time, which is a way to control people. control what they do at any moment, in any place. Okay, so I know those two things are quite different. They work, these are tools that work completely differently. I'm perfectly aware of that, okay? And I'm happy that you add for my attention this logistical or coordinating tools. Okay, fine.
Okay, so
yeah, you mentioned, Dominique, the issue of governing anyway. So I would like to stress the following situation where, as you described, Dominique, and I might use other terms than yours, but essentially the human society is becoming more chaotic, less uniformity, less vertical organization, individuals that can be very diverse. So we have this phenomenon on one side, which makes it much more difficult to predict, maybe. And on the other side, we have the everyday more obvious constraints from the limitation of the environments and the threats of human activities. So how do these two elements relate to one another? The limits in which humans are living, which are increasing, and the fact that their organization is more chaotic.
Okay, thank you for the word. I like chaotic. I mean, I've not used that word in this text. I've used it in another text, but okay, that's a very good word. And I agree with the first point. That's what I explained. Now, there are ordinary constraints. I do not deny it. My problem is in the context of people being individuals, being convinced they are free as they want. What does that mean, the ordinary constraints on them? Let's take the case of Trump and the voters for Trump, half of the population of the United States. Is the climate change a constraint? No, it's not, does not exist. You see the point. The point, a constraint does not exist in themselves if they are not received as a constraint. They do not exist. That's all. Perhaps people will die, but that's another problem. For the moment, it's not a constraint. You see, constraint does not exist in abstract. It's always constraint when people want that to be a constraint. Decided it is a constraint. Okay? So, if you have another example, I'm ready to go back. But you see, my point is, if people do not believe COVID could attack them, fine, it's not a constraint. And in my valley here, many people do not wear masks at all. It does not exist. And they say, people, they want to scare us. That's all. So it's not a constraint. You see my point?
Yes, we discussed that already, but I would make a slightly different analysis of Trump with respect to climate change. I think climate change and the environmental issue in general was much more an issue during the Trump years than during the previous presidents. It was a main theme, although he was on the denial side. That topic became a topic. While in the past, during the Obama years or before, the topic was not of the same importance. It was one topic among many others.
Yes, no, I agree with that, but we should not forget that up to 1994, so it's 25 years ago, in the United States, the climate change was a bipartisan topic. it meant generally 1/3 of the Democrats did not believe in climate change, and 2/3 of the Republicans did not believe in climate change. What happened in '94 is that it became, for the Republican Party, a truth. There are no climate changes. '94. So, of course, what with Trump, Trump won in putting everything on that. Not only on that, to be clear, to attack the establishment, to attack science, to attack elites, etc. So classical populism. And in populism, in that case, in the US, climate change did not exist. But it's not so radical, the shift, in terms, if you go on following what people thought, what you do with surveys, if you take the surveys, we have surveys a lot, as usual in the United States, you could see that at least since the early 90s, you have the same mass refusing climate change, and it has not moved a lot in the United States. And more importantly, politically, the Republican took in their program in '94, and it has never changed since, that climate change was not something interesting or important. Well, perhaps we cannot just discuss that because it's a very minor point.
Yeah, it's not maybe the main topic. I mean, if we can go back, and I would like to have Dominique's and Matthias' reaction to that. So Dominique, if I quote the English translation, say, I fail to see how planning through numbers could be the way to control or help society because the models developed to provide solutions to the problem of climate change are not yet available. And it's even truer, of course, to other environmental problems that climate change, because as you said, climate change is the simplest problem because there is a single indicator that can be targeted. So the point is, okay, planning using numerical models, okay, is not an available solution, but what I meant, or what we meant with Stéphane, planning through numbers was more providing these digital tools to allow us, the quotation by Philippe Descola, I said, to coordinate or to integrate local ways of living the world into some institutional whole, or maybe at least coordinating them without destroying too much their specificities, which are needed to deal with specific contexts. I know that this may be a naive proposition, but is that at least something that you can, imagine, or what would you say, Matthias and Dominique, about this idea?
Matthias, perhaps I've talked a lot already. Well, I will discuss that.
Okay, yeah. Matthias can start. Yes.
Well, yeah. I think Dominique should answer this because it's directed at him. But I have to say, I'm very enthusiastic about this critical and concrete engagement with this question in Dominique's contribution. And of course, the skepticism to numerically really predict or control the whole of society as it's developed at the moment, I think we can all share that. And I think to turn this into a constructive question, it is really a question how digital tools can be combined with our other analytical tools and our insights to help or further or assist society. That is, I think, a valid question. And as I said, very generally, because I don't have concrete experiences yet with that, but that may change in the future. I think these modeling experiences have to be combined with qualitative analytical insights, and the question is, of course, how to do that. So, for instance, we do have climate models, we do have ecological models. They are very complex and difficult in themselves. They are certainly not always completely predictive, but maybe may also give a range of possible developments, of possible futures, depending on certain parameters and so on, which is all already very helpful. And I think Pablo is right. We have seen that, among other things, in the COVID crisis, that modeling does help, and it is possible actually to say something about possible developments. The question is how to integrate that with the social and human factor that is, and how to bring that in. So in ecological modeling, this factor is probably on a global scale not yet sufficiently represented, and probably for the reason that it is very difficult to do so. So I would think one would probably have to try to break down the problems for having more concrete or more limited questions in which one can try out to integrate the human and social factors in, let's say, planetary modeling of certain future developments. This is an interesting task, but I don't think that we are very far in this respect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, locally, models for very limited questions, as the epidemiological future of France in a few weeks, can be useful. But basically because it's logistics, I think. Logistics means the ingredients are well known, they don't change with time, so you have some stability in the ingredients, and then you can combine them, and combine them through the computer is much easier than in our brain, okay? This is something the computer knows how to do better than we do. But it's only when ingredients don't change. But I think that we should really even forget about this side of modeling, except for very local questions. What I'm dealing is digital tools are not at all limited to that. And even if you don't know that text, I think it's worth reading. It's an old text in 1973 by Stafford Beer, which was one of the leaders of the cybernetic movement. And he wrote these small books. These are lectures actually given at the radio, at the Canadian radio in the 70s, Design in Freedom. And he uses, I mean, he's very optimistic about digital tools, maybe too much, but it's really very interesting the use that he proposes of digital tools as a coordinating tool, and not at all like as a modeling tool, okay? So this is more or less what I have in mind. And as a way of coordinating different ways of living the world, which maybe could be compatible with what Dominique says about individualism, this very chaotic, in some sense, and heterogeneous society we live in, and we don't maybe want to abandon or to leave, but how to combine that with some coherent coordination on some topics. I don't know.
Je peux ajouter un point?
Yeah, of course.
Bon, je suis très largement d'accord avec ce qu'a dit Matthias. Je veux dire par là que, bon, peut-être que j'ai mal lu votre sous-titre, mais ok. D'abord, c'est vrai que le choc a été sur to control society. Mm-hmm. Ça, c'est une notion quand même, essayer d'éviter, enfin, à mon sens. C'est quand même. Et le mot planning, parce que le planning, ça a été une grande activité d'après-guerre. Et on faisait de la planning. We were doing in France, in Nessel, and everywhere. In the American Army and so on. They were doing a lot of planning through numbers. It was banal. Okay?
It's no longer.
Pardon?
It's no longer usual
it's
now.
no longer. So why to resurface the planning notion, which is, why not? I mean, if you were, I mean, I agree that digital tools are useful. Nobody discussed that, okay? But the problem is how we articulate them. That, for me, is a great problem. How do we articulate them with qualitative analysis? Matthias was right to say it. Qualitative analysis is saying something that is not in the digital tools. I mean, we in social sciences, we're always fighting between both the quantitative analysis and the qualitative analysis. We know our anthropological work is useful. I have no doubt on that. So you have to see how to articulate one or the other. If not, it will be a disaster. I believe that strongly. And now you have also the fact that at local level, the solutions in general are far better imagined by local people, by actors, because they know their situation, far more than by going through very abstract numbers and then trying to have general solutions.
Yeah, I agree.
So now, okay, let me finish. So you have the locality thing is absolutely central. D'accord? The qualitative dimension is absolutely central. And then you have the political dimension, how you articulate that with decision processes. Okay?
Yeah, that's the point.
Those are the real questions.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Agree on that. That's what. And
okay. Yeah. And the question is, can digital tools help doing that? This is exactly what I mean since the beginning. Since, I mean, this is, I think, what Philippe Descola meant. Okay, the local is important, and then how do you coordinate the locals? Locals by themselves cannot afford. I mean, I think that to deal with the global challenges, I think, or to keep the modernity.
That is really a question. It's absolutely not obvious what you have just said. That could be. No, it's not obvious for me at all. When you see concretely, because we have a lot of things on India, in Pakistan, about local auto-organizations, okay? No, really, I mean, all the notions have to be discussed carefully here. But if you had said that, if your question had been formulated as you said it now, my mind was moved by the word planning as a way to control. That's terrible words, okay? I know it's not what you meant, but and for me, I mean, of course I understand. How could digital activity help at many levels, local, global, in terms of saying what the situation is, about policies that could be done, how that could be articulated, could be developed and articulated on political decision processes, on qualitative analysis, and what the people on the ground locally know. And we have to respect them because their solutions are often better. If that had been the frame, I would have fully agreed. I do not have, I mean, but I told, not you, Pablo, but when I discussed, Stefan, I cannot be your guy on explaining how to better use the numerical tools because it's not my job. I do not know that enough. But the other points you mentioned, then it could be discussed. And I have things to say at every level. May I ask a question to Matthias?
Yes. Please, of course, yeah.
No, it's, I mean,
yes.
Okay, no, for me, I like your talk. I mean, I'm also an historian of science in my own way. It's something which, I don't know if you have a solution for the question I will ask because I've never found the solution. It's important to say we will study the relation between science and society. Okay. As a catchword, it's very useful. It indicates a question, a problem, and a very important one. Now, at the moment you start entering it, you cannot keep with those words, I think. I mean, practically, give me your experience. I mean, de facto, we do not, that's why I was very ambiguous when I talk about science, because are you talking about academic science, industrial research, R&D, innovation, business, industry, technology, whatever. So all that is a complex continuum of things. Right. And it's the same on the society side. It's not just society. It's business, it's economy, it's geopolitics, it's financial flux of money, whatever. So science and society question is a good catchword. How could we, it's complicated because we have to be simple. We have to go back to that all the time. But at the same time, if we keep that too long, we cannot really tackle the real problem because it's far more complex. I have no answer to that. So just if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also have no answer to that, but I think you're perfectly right in this. One thing that I try to make clear, maybe not in this talk because I had very limited time, but as you say, there's so much different activity in science, so much different context, so much different contents that one has to see when one talks about science that there are different types of that science, but at the same time that they are connected, and that what is, let's say, basic science at one point becomes very close to industry at another, or the other way around, that what industry makes possible becomes a topic of a science that is, to begin with, very much remote from practical applications, and so on. So I think to see this deep structure in science is very important. And as you say, the same on the side of society. So I agree that science and society, this is a catchword to mark that there is something that one has to discuss about, something entangled. I mean, the systems way of speaking about it is sometimes convenient because with subsystems you have internal dynamics, but you can always also have the interchange with the environment. But I think in the end, it's really a question of concrete research to make clear what the connections are, to really understand them. And for instance, this old division of external and internal history of science, I think makes clear where the weakness of this kind of division lies. I think, for instance, focusing on the material means of science is a way to actually concretely show what the connections are. Because on the one hand, the material means, and I include the symbolic means there as well, they span the space of what is possible in science, what transformations of scientific knowledge are possible at a time in a society. And at the same time, they clearly mark a link to society because they are, of course, in society and they are institutionally transmitted and so on and so forth. So I think if we look at concrete examples, these, the boundaries dissolve in a way because you have very concrete links between science and society. But at the same time, you can clearly see the mechanisms that mediate between these spheres, if you want to try to separate them, and thereby understand how the interaction works, and thereby really understand more than you did before. I think it's no good to see the things as separated entities and then somehow come up with some parallels or some ideas of how generally one influences the other or so. But this concrete work, I think, can advance our understanding of the relation between science and society.
Thank you. I agree.
Mm-hmm. Follow the actors, as the other guy said. No?
It's more than follow the actors. It's follow practices,
Yeah.
material and symbolic practices.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I'd like to come back on the issue of the qualitative analysis versus the digital. And I think this question of the qualitative analysis is not only concerned about the digital, but about a global phenomenon that takes place, at least in Western countries, where it seems that governments, and various aspects of that have been mentioned, are more concerned with everyday management based on numbers justified by scientific knowledge than they are on politics. So defining or taking decisions based on ideas of how human society should be organized, on the principles and values of these societies. And so my feeling is that there is a way to have digital systems that take into account qualitative analysis, and that the question of qualitative analysis and the weakening of politics is a maybe more global phenomenon. So that's one point I wanted to make, and maybe you can react on that. And then the other question I had is, given what we have said about the relation between science and society and scientific institutions and disciplines and the necessary simplification of disciplines, but the challenges of the complicated setting of the relationship between humanity and the global ecosystem. How can we see the future of, what can we imagine about the future of knowledge organization, scientific organization, disciplines, their links with societies or industry, or are they going to evolve, and how?
In 2 minutes, please.
The same. You want me to start? You want to start, Matthias? Up to you.
Yeah. I just had something else in mind that I wanted to say. Maybe I say it first, and then I come to your question. The terms of planning and control that sound so strongly in your title, I wonder if they can be, let's say, complemented at least with the democratic potentials of the digital tools, because I think this is something that that is obvious, that digital tools have a potential to increase the possibilities of the democratic organization. Because they make hierarchies flat. Sometimes with the internet and so on, you have other ways of disseminating knowledge and information. And this is something that, of course, already influences how things go. Not always positively. I mean, if I think Dominique pointed out a number of important developments that are partly related to these developments. So obviously the digital tools do change society already at the moment, and planning and control are not the only modes in which these tools can be used, so to speak, but they can also be used for more democratic organization. And also the local, the strengthening of local groups, I think, can be achieved through this. It's really a question how these different tools are developed, combined, and how they again are politically implemented. I mean, are they owned by companies? Are they a common good? Are they state owned or organized? I mean, these are questions that that then are related to this. but this only as a thought that came to me in the earlier discussion. Now your question, of course, it's a huge question. I mean, how will the knowledge systems evolve? The idea of interdisciplinarity is always a very very much promoted one, but in reality, it's very hard to realize, actually, because you have the different jargons, you have the different ways of understanding, and actually to bring people from different disciplines together and really be productive about something is very hard to achieve, I think. And but I think there's no way around it. We have to try it, and it has to be done. There have to be institutions to do that. And eventually, I think things will change. I mean, disciplines have evolved over history and will continue to do so. I think the best way really to achieve something like this is really working on concrete problems and bringing the contributions from different disciplines together in certain concrete problems. So one could think of, the ecology, social input in so many questions in the context of the Anthropocene, for instance, where working on concrete problems, concrete questions could then force an integration of different perspectives, and including the computer sciences, I think, and in this way really advancing our understanding of certain such problems and questions and the options we have there. I think this is feasible, but it has to be done with concrete questions, I think, that are solvable, because otherwise you won't get the hardness of the problem, the rigorousness that that is needed to really for interdisciplinarity really to become constructive and not just a nice Sunday afternoon talk.
If I may say again, I fully agree with what you have said, Matthias. Just to start in the reverse direction, starting with knowledge institutions. Universities, for example. The way universities are organized is a 19th century business. Before that, it was not like that at all. Okay, so university is something which is very clearly dated. And the disciplines, the scientific disciplines, they were also at that time invented. Okay, so it's a way to ordering at a certain stage with certain purposes knowledge. Okay, well, what is striking for me is that it's also disciplines are an invention of teaching institutions. It's not research that invents discipline. It is a teaching who needs disciplines to organize the teaching. Okay, we know that. That's well known for 19th century. So disciplines might disappear. So it's a first point. I mean, at the moment, in many places in the world, certain disciplines are disappearing. For example, philosophy. Okay, for example, if you take medieval history, the last chair in Harvard is probably disappearing. Okay, so even in Harvard, you might not have a chair anymore in medieval history. Well, we say what is the problem with medieval history? Nobody cares. Fine, it disappears. Okay, so discipline might disappear, and certain are disappearing, like certain libraries are disappearing. Okay, well, that's one point. But it's also that if universities since the 1980s is more and more, you have the pedagogic dimension, the teaching dimension. But what is the core really is innovation and being on the edge of the next innovation to control the future. That's what a university has to be now. If it is like that, the notion of discipline will become far less important. My son, I mean, when you're in the École Polytechnique in Lausanne, my son is there. If you are there, disciplines, he's doing material sciences. Right? He has courses who are given under headings which looks like disciplines or subdiscipline or sub-subdisciplines. But fundamentally, what they are taught is not disciplinary knowledge. Well, okay, that's one thing. So it's the way knowledge is conceived in our society and so in university, it has moved drastically over the last 40 years compared with what was dominant since the middle of the 19th century. So we could have I would be ready to take part in a long seminar when we are finished with COVID and we could discuss seriously being in the same room and eating together, not because to eat, but because when you eat, when you drink, you talk, okay? And then you start being with a serious question. So if we organize a meeting on that, I'm in, okay? Now, on the other question of, I fully agree with Matthias. If we take this matter of digital tools, they are of very different kinds. Very. I mentioned two, and Pablo mentioned a third one, and we might add many of them. But what is important for me, since it's not technical aspects of that which I do not know, what is important is the way that is articulated on democratic choice. So how you put your result in discussion. If you do not do that, you are wrong. It will fail because it's a political problem. Also, social and political problem. It has to be articulated on precise qualitative analysis. Partly it could be integrated, partly not. Qualitative does not throw away quantitative data, but it's another way of thinking at the world. If you are an anthropologist, you look at the world in a different way compared with people making a model, for example, which is one aspect of digital tools, not more. And what is important for me, we should not forget that the people who know best their situation are themselves, not us. And so locally, it's far better to be very close to the people and the way they conceive things. And about the planning by numbers, that's a wording you start finding among engineers in mid-19th century, okay? That's absolutely clear. It is the engineers who invented that, okay? And of course for them, they were doing that, not discussing with the people who were working with the workers, all that. They were planning on them. And I think using that word will have always that connotation. That's why I would be a little more cautious and not use planning by number. That's an old trick. I mean, we know that very well. You have a lot of books on that. Already in the, I remember a meeting in the early 90s. We were always American. Everybody was there. And the book, but I forget his name. The famous book on, okay, at my age.
Trust in numbers, no? It's not that one.
Ted Porter was there.
Ted Porter, trust in
we have
numbers.
discussed all those questions among various colloquia in the 92-94 with Ted Porter and many others. And after that, some years later, he had the book. And it's real discussion. What does it mean? Why? Who convinced the other that governing by number is better? So it's not a naive question. It's a true question. It was posed.
But Dominique, as far as I remember, in Ted's book, his idea was that it was imposed as a democratic in the US. I mean, and technocrats and engineers were not very happy with that because they knew that it was too simple to characterize projects, for example, on the Mississippi River by numbers. They thought that I mean, expertise and familiarity with the object was much better than numbers, which were really a rough characterization, but they were forced by, let's say, the democratic society to make their knowledge explicit, and then losing a lot about it. But that was, I mean, because expertise was open to suspicion, and people didn't trust it anymore. So they demanded openness and numbers. That's what I remember from Ted's book. So it's the opposite of what you're saying in some sense.
It's absolutely, you're right. It's one aspect of TED books. But what has been repeated since then quite a lot, and TED does not disagree with that, is that building numbers, it's also an enclaved expertise, an expertise.
Mm-hmm. Oh, your microphone, I don't know why. Yep. We can't hear you, Dominique. Your microphone is off. I didn't do that on purpose. Okay, it's now okay.
Okay, but it doesn't matter. Okay, I just wanted to say that. Okay,
okay.
I've lost my mind.
Okay, so maybe we should come to an ending, but Juliette, who has been here from the beginning, wanted to ask a question or make a remark, and then we can end up by that. Okay, go ahead, Juliette.
It's just I didn't know really how to get into the conversation because it was framed in a way which is very far away from my culture. Because I really come from the wicked problem approach and post-normal science, where I would say that everything was okay 30 years ago, to say that anyway science produces too much uncertainty in real time. So scientists usually can't answer the question that we need to answer now. So they can help framing, they can help giving informations, but that the first framing should come from society, so qualitative issues. And actually there are many schools that have developed tools that are also numerical, or even trying to make people converge through internet. And usually they mix this qualitative and quantitative information, qualitative being more like what are relevant indicators, and also what are the spaces on which we can actually act or not at one time in space, which is kind of important also to describe. And then the involvement of scientists is like to answer to these qualitative questions in a way so that we can have evaluation between two options and try to qualify in which indicator one option is better and in which indicator an option is worse. But of course, this is, I mean, there are many tools. I know many people who work on that. Problem is that you need a real political desire for that, because it's very long, because the stakeholders have to take time, and also they have to be able to listen to the other people. And when you say, Dominique, that interdisciplinarity is growing, it's true maybe within, I would say, two blocks of science, which is the quantitative, there is a truth science, and the qualitative, there is no truth, and categories have to evolve with society, and categories don't exist per se, blah, blah, blah. And so more constructionist and more positivist views. And my feeling is this link is really crashing more and more rather than getting closer. So, but I don't know if when you talk about your son doing this type of study where it's more transdisciplinary, is it also with a bit of critical science, I would say, or not?
Thank you, Juliette. Hello. I'd seen that Juliette was there, but I didn't know it was you. But
this Juliette,
just Juliette, and there might be several Juliette in the world. No, I'm not saying at all that interdisciplinary is growing. I said that in certain milieu, and I guess between us, we believe that listening to the others and trying to respect what is going on and to see what could be done in between it's an ideal we share, and it should be like that. The fact that it is not, it's true, it is not. And my point is not only interdisciplinary. My point is not the discussion between academic disciplines. My point is also a wider spectrum of people involved in the disciplines. I don't know whom, let's call, if we use the word local population, NGOs, whatever. That is at least as important as the interdisciplinary. Because what is brought by those other actors is quite different frames to look at things. And that is crucial. So, well.
Okay, so a final word, Matthias or Stefan?
Matthias?
Well, I agree with what Dominique just said. That may be my final word. I think you can wrap up our discussion. I thought it was very inspiring, and I'm very grateful for this invitation and for Dominique's presentation and this discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to both of you for participating. We had a very small attendance. I don't know why. I don't know what happened. The attendance was around 50 people before, so we will see. Anyway, the video will be online, will be put online, so people will be able to follow it. Thank you very much to both, and we'll continue offline the discussion on these challenging issues.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dominique. Thanks, Matthias.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And see you in real world one time.
Yeah, hopefully. Yes. Fingers crossed. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.